Whispers in the dark alleys of Chicago never mentioned corporate accountants. Bullets and cold, hard cash were the usual currency of power, but a single encrypted ledger held enough leverage to dismantle the most feared syndicate in the Midwest. Nobody ever looked twice at Chelsea Foster. Carrying 240 pounds on a 5'4" frame society had cruelly relegated her to the invisible background, labeling her the girl no one wanted. They made a fatal miscalculation. When a ruthless crime lord realized her brilliant mind was the only thing standing between his empire and utter destruction, invisibility transformed into a lethal, all-consuming obsession. Fluorescent lights hummed a monotonous, soul-draining tune above the sprawling cubicle maze of Oakhaven Financial Group. It was an elite wealth management firm perched on the 42nd floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper overlooking the Chicago River, dealing with clients who preferred their vast fortunes kept quietly out of the IRS's reach. Chelsea Foster sat anchored at her desk, her eyes burning from staring at the dual monitors for 11 hours straight. She was 26, brilliant with numbers, and completely invisible to everyone around her, except when they needed a target. At 240 pounds, Chelsea had spent her entire life navigating a world that equated physical thinness with human worth. She wore loose, dark cardigans to minimize her soft, round figure, pulling her thick chestnut hair into a tight, severe bun to avoid drawing attention. It never worked. The cruelty of the corporate world was subtle, but sharp. "Chelsea, honey, are you really going to eat that entire muffin?" The voice belonged to Penelope Hayes, a senior wealth manager who looked like she subsisted entirely on black coffee and Pilates. Penelope leaned against the edge of Chelsea's cubicle, her eyes dropping to the blueberry muffin resting on a napkin next to Chelsea's keyboard. A smirk played on Penelope's lips, a masterclass in passive-aggressive torment. Chelsea felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. "It's my dinner, Penelope. I'm working late." "Right. Well, just thinking about your health," Penelope purred, turning on her designer heels. "Some of us have the company gala to think about. Not that you ever go. Arthur needs the quarterly projections by tomorrow morning. Don't fall asleep." As Penelope's perfume faded, Chelsea let out a shaky breath. She hated the sting of tears, the way her weight made her a perpetual punchline to people who barely possessed a fraction of her intellect. She was a senior forensic auditor, holding a master's degree from Northwestern University, yet Arthur Sterling, the managing partner of Oakhaven, paid her half of what her male colleagues made and kept her hidden in the back office. She was the firm's secret weapon, the workhorse who untangled the most complex financial knots. But she was never invited to client dinners. She didn't fit the aesthetic of Oakhaven. Pushing the muffin aside, Chelsea turned her focus back to the SAP accounting software on her screen. She had been tasked with a routine internal audit of a portfolio belonging to a shell corporation named Corsa Holdings. Arthur had explicitly told her to just rubber stamp the reconciliation, claiming it was an old legacy account transferring funds to a real estate firm in Miami. But Chelsea's brain didn't work like that. She saw patterns where others saw chaos. At 11:45 p.m., the office entirely empty Chelsea found the anomaly. It started as a minor discrepancy, a fraction of a percentage point in currency conversion fees routed through a server in the Cayman Islands. But as Chelsea dug deeper, bypassing Oakhaven's internal firewalls with a few lines of code, she had written herself, the rabbit hole opened up. Corsa Holdings wasn't a real estate firm. It was a massive, sophisticated laundering operation. Chelsea's heart began to hammer against her ribs. She pulled up the wire transfer logs from the past 4 years. Tens of millions of dollars were being systematically filtered from illicit cash businesses, casinos, private sanitation companies and shipping ports scrubbed clean through high-yield stock trades and deposited into offshore accounts. And then she saw the name buried deep in the metadata of a heavily encrypted PDF invoice. Coleman. A cold sweat broke out across Chelsea's neck. Everyone in Chicago knew who the Coleman family was. They weren't just organized crime. They were a corporate syndicate, a shadow government that controlled politicians, judges, and half the unions in the state. And Arthur Sterling, her pompous, condescending boss, was personally signing off on the laundering of their money. Worse, Chelsea realized as she stared at the screen, Arthur had been making mistakes. The recent transfers were sloppy. Millions were unaccounted for bleeding out into a secondary hidden account under Arthur's own credentials. Arthur was skimming from the Mafia. Panic seized Chelsea's chest. She was staring at a death sentence. If the Colemans found out Arthur was a dead man. If Arthur knew she had seen this, she was a dead woman. She immediately began downloading the raw data onto a secure, encrypted flash drive she kept on her keychain. Her fingers trembled violently, misstriking the keys. She had to protect herself. She needed insurance. Just as the progress bar hit 99%, the heavy glass doors at the front of the office clicked open. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed on the marble floor. Chelsea froze, her breath catching in her throat. She yanked the flash drive from the port, shoved it into her bra, and quickly minimized the windows on her screen, pulling up a standard Excel spreadsheet, just as Arthur Sterling rounded the corner. Arthur's tie was loosened, and he smelled faintly of scotch and expensive cigars. He stopped when he saw Chelsea, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Foster, what the hell are you still doing here?" he demanded, his voice slurring slightly. You asked for the quarterly projections by morning, Mr. Sterling." Chelsea stammered, hating how small her voice sounded. Arthur's gaze darted to her monitors. "Did you finish the Corsa reconciliation?" Chelsea swallowed hard, forcing her face to remain completely blank. "Yes. Everything balanced perfectly. Just a routine transfer." Arthur stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Chelsea prayed he couldn't hear the frantic beating of her heart. Finally, a greasy smile spread across his face. "Good girl. Keep your head down, do the math, and leave the big picture to the adults. Go home, Foster." Chelsea grabbed her purse and practically fled the building, the cold metal of the flash drive pressing against her skin, burning like a brand. She didn't know it yet, but her invisible life was already over. Tuesday morning brought a suffocating, unnatural tension to the executive floor of Oakhaven Financial. The usual arrogant swagger of the brokers and wealth managers was entirely absent. Instead, there was a palpable, frantic terror. Chelsea sat at her desk, nursing a terrible headache. She hadn't slept a wink. She had spent the night staring at the ceiling of her cramped apartment in Logan Square, trying to decide whether to run, go to the FBI, or pretend she had seen nothing. At 10:00 a.m., the atmosphere shifted. 4 massive men in impeccably tailored dark Italian suits stepped off the private elevator. They moved with a silent, synchronized lethality that instantly silenced the bullpen. Following them was a man who seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room, Darby Coleman. He was 34, devastatingly handsome, and entirely terrifying. He didn't look like a street thug. He looked like a ruthless Fortune 500 CEO. His sharp jawline was covered in a faint shadow of stubble, and his dark, piercing eyes scanned the room with the cold calculation of an apex predator. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that clung to broad, muscular shoulders, radiating power and an underlying, coiled violence. Arthur Sterling practically fell out of his glass-walled office, his face the color of spoiled milk. "Mr. Coleman, we weren't expecting you." "Clearly, Arthur," Darby said. His voice was a low, smooth baritone that sent a shiver down Chelsea's spine, even from across the room. "We have a problem with the ledger, specifically a discrepancy of $4.2 million. My accountants tell me your systems are leaking." Arthur began to sweat profusely. "There must be a mistake, a software glitch. I can assure you every penny is accounted for." "I don't deal in glitches, Arthur," Darby replied softly. "I want to see the person who handled the Corsa file. Now." Chelsea felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. Arthur's panicked eyes swept the room and locked onto her cubicle. He was going to use her as the scapegoat. He was going to feed her to the wolves. "Foster!" Arthur barked, his voice cracking. "Get in here! Bring the Corsa files!" Every eye in the office turned to Chelsea. Penelope covered her mouth, trying to hide a smirk, undoubtedly thinking Chelsea was about to be fired for incompetence. Chelsea stood up, her knees knocking together. She felt huge, clumsy, and entirely exposed under the sudden scrutiny. She gathered the thick file folders, her hands shaking, and walked toward the glass conference room. As she entered, the 4 bodyguards stared at her with blank, uncaring expressions. Arthur looked furious and terrified, but it was Darby Coleman's reaction that stopped Chelsea in her tracks. Darby didn't look past her. He didn't avert his eyes in disgust or look at her with the polite, strained tolerance she was used to from attractive men. Instead, his dark eyes locked onto hers, and a strange, intense spark ignited in his gaze. He took in her flushed, rounded cheeks, the frantic pulse beating at the base of her throat, the soft, generous curves hidden beneath her oversized sweater. He tracked her movements with an unblinking, predatory focus. "This is Chelsea Foster," Arthur sneered, throwing her under the bus immediately. "She's a junior auditor. She handled the reconciliation. If there is a mistake, Mr. Coleman, it was her incompetence. I'll have her terminated immediately." Chelsea felt a hot flash of anger cut through her terror. "I am a senior forensic auditor," she corrected, her voice trembling but surprisingly firm, "and there was no mistake in my reconciliation." Arthur glared at her. "Shut up, Chelsea." Darby raised a single-gloved hand. The room fell instantly, deathly silent. He slowly walked around the mahogany conference table until he was standing just inches from Chelsea. He was incredibly tall, forcing her to tilt her head back to look at him. He smelled of cedarwood, expensive bergamot, and danger. "You say there was no mistake, Miss Foster," Darby murmured, leaning in slightly. "No, sir." Chelsea breathed, her heart hammering wildly. "The ledger balances on the front end, but the routing numbers attached to the offshore clearinghouse have been manually altered. The money didn't vanish. It was diverted." Arthur gasped. "She's lying. She doesn't know what she's talking about. She's a nobody. Darby, just look at her." Before Arthur could finish the sentence, Darby moved with terrifying speed. He grabbed Arthur by the throat of his custom shirt and slammed him backward against the glass wall of the conference room. The glass shuddered violently. "Do not ever," Darby hissed, his voice dropping to a demonic whisper, "interrupt her again, and do not disrespect her in my presence." Chelsea gasped, stepping back. Darby released Arthur, who collapsed, coughing onto the floor. Darby casually adjusted his cuffs, turning his full, overwhelming attention back to Chelsea. The coldness in his eyes melted into something far more dangerous, profound, consuming fascination. "You found the diversion," Darby stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Chelsea whispered. "And you know who diverted it?" Chelsea looked at the pathetic, gasping form of Arthur Sterling on the floor. She looked back at Darby. If she told the truth, she was entering a world of blood and crime. But if she lied, Darby would know, and Arthur would kill her anyway to cover his tracks. "I have the proof," Chelsea said, her voice steadying. "On a secure drive, Arthur created a dummy LLC named Apex Consulting. He's been skimming your transfers for 8 months. Darby stared at her. For a woman society had deemed unworthy of notice, Chelsea Foster possessed a spine of absolute steel. Most hardened criminals wept and begged when faced with the Coleman family. This soft, beautiful woman, in a frumpy sweater, had just looked the devil in the eye and handed him his betrayer on a silver platter. Darby's lips curved into a slow, terrifying smile. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a smile of possession. "Vinny," Darby called out without breaking eye contact with Chelsea. One of the massive bodyguards stepped forward. "Yeah, boss." "Take Mr. Sterling for a ride. Have a long chat with him about Apex Consulting." Darby's gaze dropped to Chelsea's lips, then back to her wide, terrified eyes. "And pack up Miss Foster's desk. She doesn't work for Oakhaven anymore. She works directly for me." "What?" Chelsea choked out. "No, I can't. I don't work for the Mafia." Darby stepped closer, lifting a hand to gently, almost reverently, brush a stray lock of chestnut hair behind her ear. His touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "You do now, Chelsea," he whispered, tasting her name on his tongue. "And you are going to be very, very safe." Chelsea didn't wait for Vinny to pack her desk. The moment Darby Coleman stepped out of the conference room to take a phone call, chaos erupted as Arthur realized his impending doom. In the brief window of confusion, Chelsea bolted. She grabbed her purse, shoved her way into the stairwell, and ran down 42 flights of stairs, her lungs burning, her legs trembling under her weight. She burst onto the Chicago streets, hailing a cab with frantic desperation. She gave the driver an address 3 blocks from her apartment, paranoid that she was being followed. She knew what she had done. She had exposed a man who stole from the mob, and in doing so, she had caught the eye of the most dangerous man in the city. Darby Coleman didn't just look at her like an employee. He looked at her like a starving man who had just found a feast. The intensity in his eyes terrified her far more than Arthur's threats. Chelsea ran the 3 blocks in the biting wind, unlocking the heavy iron gate to her rundown apartment complex. She sprinted up to the 3rd floor, locked her deadbolt, fastened the chain, and collapsed against the door, sobbing uncontrollably. She had to run. She needed to pack a bag, take the flash drive, and get to a bus station. Maybe Canada. Maybe Europe. She pushed herself off the floor and rushed to her bedroom, dragging a duffel bag from the closet. She started throwing clothes into it, haphazardly. Sweaters, jeans, whatever her hands touched. Crack. The sound of her front door splintering echoed like a gunshot through the tiny apartment. Chelsea froze, the blood draining from her face. Heavy, hurried footsteps moved into her living room. It wasn't Darby's men. They wore tailored suits and moved with precision. These footsteps were chaotic, heavy, and accompanied by muttered curses. "Find the fat bitch and find the drive," a rough voice growled. "Sterling wants it done clean." Arthur. Arthur hadn't been taken by Vinny yet, or he had managed to make a phone call before they grabbed him. He had sent a clean-up crew to silence her before Darby could officially take her under his wing. Chelsea panicked. She looked around her bedroom. There was no fire escape. The window dropped 3 stories to a concrete alley. She backed into the corner, grabbing a heavy brass lamp from her nightstand, clutching it to her chest like a pathetic shield. The bedroom door was kicked open. 2 men stood there wearing cheap leather jackets and holding suppressed pistols. The taller one grinned a nasty, yellowed smile. "Well, well, Sterling said you were a big girl, but damn," the man sneered, raising his gun. "Make it easy, sweetheart. Hand over the flash drive and I'll aim for the head. Quick and painless." Chelsea squeezed her eyes shut, clutching the flash drive hidden inside her bra. She prepared for the end. Suddenly, a deafening roar shattered the window behind the men. Glass exploded inward like a tidal wave of diamonds. Before the hitmen could even turn, 3 rapid silenced gunshots, thwip, 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 punched through the air. Chelsea screamed, dropping the lamp and covering her ears. When she opened her eyes, both of Sterling's hitmen were dead on the floor, perfectly precise holes drilled through their foreheads. Standing in the doorway of her apartment, stepping over the splintered wood of her front door, was Darby Coleman. He was no longer the calm, collected businessman from the boardroom. His jacket was off the sleeves of his crisp white shirt, rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and dark ink. In his right hand, he held a sleek, smoking handgun. Vinny and 2 other men flooded into the apartment behind him, instantly securing the perimeter. Darby didn't look at the dead men. His furious, panicked eyes swept the room until they found Chelsea cowering in the corner. The murderous rage instantly vanished from his expression, replaced by profound, agonizing relief. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides, dropping to his knees right in front of her. He didn't care about the broken glass on the floor. "Chelsea." He breathed his voice, thick with an emotion she couldn't comprehend. He reached out his large, warm hands, gently gripping her shoulders. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" No. Chelsea stammered, shaking so violently her teeth chattered. You killed them. They came here to kill you," Darby said fiercely, his thumbs gently stroking her collarbones, grounding her in reality. "Sterling made a phone call before my men could secure him. It was a mistake that cost him his life. And it almost cost me everything." Chelsea looked at him, bewildered. "Almost cost you? You don't even know me." Darby's eyes darkened, locking onto hers with that terrifying, magnetic pull. "I know enough. I know you're brilliant. I know you're brave enough to look a predator in the eyes. And I know that in a room full of greedy, pathetic sycophants, you were the most breathtakingly real thing I had ever seen." Chelsea's breath hitched, breathtaking her. She was 240 pounds. She was the punchline, the invisible girl. "You're in shock," Darby said softly, misreading her stunned silence. He stood up in one fluid motion and effortlessly scooped her into his arms. Chelsea gasped instinctively, wrapping her arms around his thick neck as her feet left the ground. "What are you doing? Put me down. I'm too heavy for you to carry." Darby didn't even break a sweat. He held her tightly against his broad chest, his grip firm and possessive. "You are perfectly fine, Chelsea. You weigh nothing to me. And I am never putting you down." He turned and walked out of the bedroom, stepping over the bodies of the hitmen without a second glance. "Vinny, burn this place down. Make it look like a gas leak. Erase every trace of Chelsea Foster from the public record." "Yes, boss," Vinny grunted, pulling a flare from his jacket. "Wait," Chelsea cried out, thrashing slightly in Darby's grip. "You can't do that. My life is here." "Your life was here." Darby corrected her smoothly, his voice a dark velvet promise as he carried her down the stairs. "Your life here almost got you killed, because society is too blind to see your worth. From this moment on, you belong to me, and nobody touches what is mine." 10 minutes later, Chelsea was sitting in the back of a heavily armored SUV wrapped in Darby's suit jacket, speeding toward a private helipad. As the Chicago skyline blurred past the tinted windows, Darby sat beside her, his hand resting casually but firmly on her thigh. She was a captive. She had just been abducted by the head of the Coleman crime family. Yet as she looked at his profile illuminated by the passing streetlights, Chelsea realized the most terrifying truth of all. For the first time in her life, she felt entirely seen, entirely valued, and dangerously, intoxicatingly safe. The invisible accountant was dead. The Mafia boss's obsession had just been born. Turbulence rattled the cabin of the Augusta Westland AW-109 helicopter as it swept across the pitch-black expanse of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Chelsea gripped the leather armrest, her knuckles turning white. Below them, a sprawling, fortress-like estate emerged from the dense pine forests, illuminated by high-grade perimeter floodlights and armed patrols. It looked less like a vacation home and more like a militarized compound for a sovereign nation. Darby sat across from her, a crystal tumbler of Macallan 25 in his hand, watching her with that same unsettling, unwavering intensity. He hadn't looked away for the entire 45-minute flight from Chicago. "Relax your grip, Chelsea," Darby murmured, his voice cutting through the noise of the rotors via her Bose headset. "You're cutting off the circulation in your hands." "You kidnapped me," Chelsea shot back, her voice shaking but defiant. "Forgive me if I'm not entirely relaxed." "I relocated you," he corrected smoothly. "Kidnapping implies I plan to ask for a ransom. But there isn't enough money in the Federal Reserve to make me give you back." The helicopter touched down gently on a reinforced concrete pad. Darby was out of his seat, instantly offering his hand. When Chelsea hesitated, he didn't force her, simply waiting with the patience of a predator who knew its prey had nowhere else to go. Reluctantly, she placed her hand in his. His grip was warm, calloused and engulfing. Inside the estate, the sheer magnitude of Coleman's wealth hit Chelsea like a physical blow. The foyer was a masterpiece of imported Italian marble-vaulted ceilings and priceless Renaissance art. A team of staff stood at attention, their eyes strictly averted to the floor. "Matteo!" Darby barked to a rugged silver-haired man wearing a tailored three-piece suit. "Is the East Wing secured?" "Completely, boss," Matteo replied, his gaze flickering briefly to Chelsea before respectfully dropping. "Biometric locks are active. The wardrobe has been stocked according to your exact specifications. Katerina has prepared a meal." "Good. Increase the perimeter guard by double. If a single squirrel crosses the property line, I want to know about it." Darby turned to Chelsea, his expression softening imperceptibly. "You must be exhausted and hungry. We will eat, and then you will sleep." Chelsea was ushered into a grand dining room overlooking the dark waters of the lake. The mahogany table could seat 30, but only 2 places were set intimately close together. A feast of handmade pappardelle, braised short ribs and fresh focaccia was laid out. Chelsea, whose usual dinner consisted of sad microwave meals or office pastries, felt her stomach rumble betrayingly. Yet her deep-seated insecurities flared. Eating in front of men had always been a source of intense humiliation. She was painfully aware of her 240 pounds, the way her thighs spread out on the plush velvet chair, the softness of her arms. She kept her hands folded in her lap, staring down at the exquisite food. Darby noticed immediately. He set his silver fork down, the sharp clink echoing in the cavernous room. "Why aren't you eating?" I'm not very hungry," Chelsea lied, her cheeks burning crimson. Darby leaned closer, his dark eyes tracing the flush on her face. "Do not lie to me, Chelsea. Not ever. I heard your stomach. Eat." "You don't understand," she whispered, looking away, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. People usually have something to say when I eat." A terrifying, icy silence fell over the room. When Chelsea finally dared to look at Darby, the murderous rage she had seen in her apartment had returned, hardening his handsome features into a mask of pure violence. "Who?" Darby demanded, his voice dropping to a lethal octave. "Give me names. I will have their tongues cut out before sunrise." Chelsea gasped, horrified. "No, Darby, no. It's just society. Colleagues. Penelope at the office." "Penelope Hayes?" Darby asked, his memory frighteningly sharp. "Consider her handled." "Darby, stop!" Chelsea pleaded, reaching out to touch his arm. The moment her fingers grazed his forearm, he froze, his anger instantly evaporating, replaced by an intense, magnetic focus on where her skin met his. "You can't just hurt people because they made a snide comment. I'm used to it. I know what I look like." Darby slowly covered her trembling hand with his thumb tracing her knuckles. "You have no idea what you look like. You look at yourself through the eyes of weak, blind fools who worship bone and starvation. I look at you and see abundance, softness, a woman who is entirely real. You are magnificent, Chelsea. Every curve, every inch." He picked up a piece of warm focaccia, dipped it in olive oil, and brought it to her lips. "Eat," he commanded softly, his eyes burning with possession. "Nourish yourself. Nobody will ever make you feel small in this house." Trembling under the weight of his absolute devotion, Chelsea parted her lips and took a bite. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. For the first time in her 26 years, she wasn't just tolerated. She was worshipped. Morning light filtered through the heavy silk drapes of Chelsea's sprawling suite. She woke up tangled in expensive Egyptian cotton sheets, momentarily disoriented, before the chaotic memories of the previous night came rushing back. The assassination attempt, the helicopter ride, Darby's intense, terrifying dechelciations. She threw off the covers and walked into the massive walk-in closet Matteo had mentioned. It was filled with designer clothing, Brunello Cucinelli, cashmere sweaters, silk blouses, tailored trousers, all perfectly tailored to her exact plus-size measurements. These weren't baggy, shapeless clothes meant to hide her body, but elegant garments designed to accentuate and celebrate her generous curves. Darby hadn't just stocked a closet, he had studied her frame meticulously. Dressing in a soft burgundy cashmere sweater and black trousers, Chelsea ventured out of her suite. 2 heavily armed guards stationed at her door immediately snapped to attention, falling into step exactly 10 paces behind her as she navigated the labyrinthine corridors. She found Darby in a state-of-the-art command center situated deep beneath the main house. Walls of monitors displayed global financial markets, shipping routes out of the port of Chicago, and live security feeds. He was barking orders in rapid-fire Italian into a secure satellite phone, but the moment Chelsea entered, he abruptly ended the call. "Did you sleep well?" Darby asked, his eyes sweeping over her outfit with visible primal approval. "As well as a hostage can," Chelsea replied, colmang her arms defensively. "What happens now, Darby? I can't just live in a golden cage forever. I have a life. I have an aunt in Florida who will worry. Your aunt received a secure wire transfer of $2 million this morning, along with a notarized letter from you stating you accepted a high-clearance government auditing job overseas." Darby stated calmly, pouring her a cup of freshly brewed espresso from an industrial machine. "As for your life, it is here now, but you won't be idle." He gestured to a high-end workstation, outfitted with 4 massive curved monitors and a mechanical keyboard. "I didn't just bring you here to protect you, Chelsea. I brought you here because you possess a mind I desperately need." Chelsea stepped closer to the monitors, her professional curiosity warring with her moral outrage. "What is this?" "The complete financial network of the Moretti family." Darby explained, his expression hardening into cold stone. "They are a rival syndicate encroaching on my East Coast ports. They use a proprietary blockchain system and AES 256 encryption to launder their money and pay their hitmen. My cyber division has been trying to crack it for 6 months. They failed. And you think I can? Chelsea asked, staring at the cascades of raw, encrypted data. You bypassed Oakhaven's internal firewalls, which cost me $10 million to install, using a few lines of code, while eating a blueberry muffin. Darby said, a rare, genuine smirk gracing his lips. I know you can. Chelsea sat down in the ergonomic leather chair. The challenge was intoxicating. For years she had been given mundane tasks, her brilliance stifled by Arthur's fragile ego, and a corporate world that judged her on her BMI rather than her IQ. Now she was being handed the ultimate, most dangerous puzzle. If I do this, Chelsea said, not looking away from the screens, if I map their entire financial structure and expose their vulnerabilities, what do I get? Darby leaned over the chair, his solid chest brushing lightly against her shoulder. The heat radiating from his body was entirely distracting. Anything you desire, Chelsea. Name your price. I want my freedom, she said, finally looking up into his dark, dangerous eyes. Darby's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. The possessive fire in his gaze flared hot and unyielding. I will give you the world, Chelsea. I will give you wealth, power, and protection, but you will never leave me. Ask for something else. Realizing she had pushed against an impenetrable steel wall, Chelsea turned back to the monitors. Over the next 2 weeks, the underground command center became her domain. She worked relentlessly, unraveling the Moretti family's complex web of shell companies, cryptocurrency tumblers, and offshore dummy corporations. Darby was a constant looming presence. He brought her meals himself, refusing to let her skip eating. He would massage her tense shoulders during long hours, his firm touch becoming a terrifyingly comforting addiction that she craved. However, on the 15th day, Chelsea found something that made the blood in her veins freeze. She had finally managed to decrypt the core Moretti ledger, tracing a massive structured payout of $50 million. But the money wasn't going to a Colombian cartel or a corrupt Illinois politician. It was bouncing back into Chicago. Specifically, it was being routed into a holding company heavily invested in by Darby's own organization. Chelsea's fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing the routing numbers with the internal files Darby had given her. The puzzle pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. Darby wasn't just fighting the Morettis. He was being betrayed by someone deep inside his own inner circle. Someone who was feeding the Morettis his shipping schedules and taking $50 million in blood money as compensation. Chelsea pulled up the final layer of metadata, praying to God she was wrong. The name of the holding company's primary beneficiary decoded on the screen in glaring green text. Lorenzo Coleman, Darby's younger brother. Chelsea shoved her chair back, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Lorenzo was Darby's second-in-command, the man who ran the lucrative ground operations in the city. If she showed this to Darby, she would be igniting a bloody civil war within the Mafia family. You stopped typing. Chelsea jumped, a scream caught in her throat. She hadn't heard Lorenzo enter the room. He stood in the doorway of the command center, a suppressed Glock 19 hanging loosely in his right hand. Lorenzo shared Darby's dark, handsome Italian features, but his eyes were empty, devoid of soul, and incredibly cruel. You're a very smart girl, Chelsea, Lorenzo sneered, stepping into the room and locking the heavy steel door behind him. Too smart for your own good. I told Darby it was a mistake bringing an outsider into the family. A fat little accountant playing with the big boys. Chelsea slowly stood up, trying to keep the massive desk between them. You're the mole. You're selling out your own brother to the Morettis. Business is business, Lorenzo said smoothly, raising the gun. Darby has gotten soft. He's obsessed with you instead of running the empire. Once I put a bullet in your head, I'll tell him you were a spy for the FBI. He'll be heartbroken, but he'll recover. And I'll take my rightful place as the head of the family." Lorenzo aimed the gun precisely at her chest. "Say goodbye, Piggy." Chelsea squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the fatal impact. Suddenly, the reinforced steel door of the command center groaned violently. A split second later, it buckled inward as a massive C4 explosive charge blew the biometric lock clean off its hinges. Smoke fire and concrete debris filled the room as Darby burst through the shattered threshold like an avenging demon. Lorenzo spun around, startled by the explosion, but he wasn't fast enough. Darby didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions. He raised his own weapon and fired 3 rapid shots. The bullets tore through Lorenzo's chest, dropping his brother to the floor in a pool of expanding red. Chelsea collapsed against the desk, hyperventilating, as the deafening echoes of the gunfire rang in her ears. Darby threw his gun aside and sprinted to her, crushing her into his chest. He was shaking his massive frame, trembling with a lethal adrenaline crash. He buried his face in her thick chestnut hair, breathing her in like oxygen. "Are you hurt?" Darby demanded, pulling back just enough to inspect every inch of her face, his hands frantically checking her body for wounds. "Chelsea, look at me. Did he hurt you?" "No." Chelsea sobbed, burying her face against his chest, her resistance finally breaking as she gripped his shirt. "He didn't fire. You got him." Darby pulled her tighter, kissing the top of her head with desperate, reverent fervor. He looked down at his own brother's lifeless body, his expression entirely devoid of grief, replaced only by a chilling, absolute ruthlessness. "Nobody threatens what is mine," Darby whispered fiercely into her ear, the vow echoing in the ruined room. "Not my enemies, not my blood. Nobody." Gunpowder hung heavy in the subterranean air, a bitter perfume masking the monumental shift in power that had just occurred. Lorenzo Coleman lay motionless on the cold concrete, a stark reminder of the absolute, terrifying loyalty Darby commanded. Vinny and Matteo arrived within 90 seconds of the blast, their faces impassive as they surveyed the ruined biometric door and the dead underboss. "Clean it up," Darby ordered, his voice devoid of any familial grief. He didn't look at his men. His entire focus remained anchored on Chelsea, whose face was buried in his ruined, soot-stained shirt. "And initiate a total lockdown. If Lorenzo was moving money to Salvatore Moretti, he likely compromised our perimeter." Chelsea trembled, but as Darby's solid heartbeat thumped steadily against her cheek, a profound realization washed over her. She had spent her entire life trying to shrink, attempting to apologize for taking up space in a world that demanded she be small, invisible, and silent. Yet here stood the most dangerous man in Chicago, a kingmaker who had just executed his own flesh and blood without a second thought, simply because Lorenzo had threatened her. Pulling back slightly, Chelsea looked up into Darby's dark, fierce eyes. The terrified, frumpy accountant from Oakhaven Financial was dead. The woman who stared back at the Mafia boss was something entirely new. "I need to get back to the console," Chelsea said, her voice surprisingly steady, though her hand still shook slightly. Darby frowned, his grip tightening protectively around her thick waist. "Absolutely not. You are in shock. I am taking you upstairs to rest." "Darby, listen to me," Chelsea insisted, pushing gently against his chest. Lorenzo was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. If he planned to kill me and take over, he wouldn't just leave the financial pipeline open. He was a systems guy. He would have built a failsafe. Matteo, standing near the ruined doorway, paused. "She might be right, boss. Lorenzo managed the encrypted communications with the New York syndicates." Darby's jaw set, but he released her, stepping back just enough to let her access the undamaged half of the workstation. "You have 10 minutes, Chelsea. Then I am carrying you upstairs myself." Chelsea sank back into the leather chair. She ignored the body being dragged out of the room and focused entirely on the cascading code. She bypassed Lorenzo's personal login, using a brute force decryption script she had written in college, delving into the deepest hidden partitions of the Coleman server. 5 minutes passed in tense, suffocating silence. The only sound was the rapid clatter of Chelsea's mechanical keyboard. Then the screens flashed an ominous, pulsing amber. "Found it." Chelsea breathed, her stomach plummeting. Oh God. He did build a failsafe. It's a dead man's switch tied to his biometric heartbeat monitor. When his heart stopped, a master executable file triggered. "What did it do?" Darby demanded, leaning over her shoulder, his massive presence a shield against the glaring monitors. "It dropped the firewall on your primary Swiss accounts," Chelsea explained rapidly, her fingers flying across the keys as she tried to patch the breach. "But that's just a distraction. The real payload is a localized GPS broadcast." He sent the exact coordinates of this Lake Geneva estate, along with the security gate override codes, directly to Salvatore Moretti's secure server. And he pinged the regional director of the FBI in Chicago, an agent named Harrison Croft. Darby cursed violently in Italian. "Croft has been on Moretti's payroll for a decade. Lorenzo just handed them my fortress on a silver platter." "How long ago did the broadcast go out?" Matteo asked, drawing his weapon. 12 minutes ago," Chelsea said, her eyes wide as she looked at Darby. "They're coming. If Moretti wants to end the Coleman family, he's going to send everything he has right now, while he thinks you're blinded." The compound's klaxon alarms suddenly began to shriek, a deafening mechanical howl that vibrated through the floorboards. "Perimeter breach," Vinny yelled into his radio. "We have multiple heavily armed bogies in tactical gear advancing through the south tree line. They bypassed the outer gates." Darby didn't panic. He moved with the terrifying, calculated precision of a war general. He turned to Chelsea, grabbing her face gently between his large, rough hands. "Matteo is taking you to the panic room. It is reinforced with foot-thick titanium. You will lock the door, and you will not open it until you hear my voice." "Do you understand?" "No," Chelsea said. Darby blinked, visibly stunned by her defiance. "Chelsea, this is not a negotiation. Heavily armed hitmen are storming my home. And if you put me in a titanium box, you lose your only advantage." Chelsea fired back, her brilliant mind racing 10 steps ahead. "Moretti sent his men here because he thinks he has the upper hand. He thinks your accounts are frozen and your security is down. But I still have the back door into Moretti's blockchain that I cracked yesterday. He doesn't know I have it." "What are you proposing?" Darby asked, his dark eyes narrowing with a mixture of disbelief and profound admiration. "You hold them off on the ground," Chelsea stated, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk. "Give me 20 minutes. I will go into the FinCEN database, spoof Harrison Croft's credentials, and flag every single one of Moretti's offshore accounts for international terrorism funding. The moment I execute the script, the SWIFT network will automatically freeze his assets globally. I will bankrupt the Moretti family in real time." Darby stared at the magnificent, heavily curved woman sitting before him. She was not a damsel in distress. She was a weapon of mass destruction. "Matteo, secure this room. Vinny, get the heavy artillery," Darby barked, pulling a sleek, customized assault rifle from a hidden weapons locker beneath the floorboards. He leaned down and pressed a hard, bruising, desperately passionate kiss to Chelsea's lips. It was a brand of ownership and a promise of survival. "Ruin them, my queen." Gunfire erupted across the manicured lawns of the estate a deafening symphony of violence that echoed over the dark waters of Lake Geneva. From the command center monitors, Chelsea watched the thermal imaging cameras. Dozens of Moretti's men wearing military-grade tactical gear were swarming the property. But Darby Coleman was not a man. He was a force of nature. Chelsea watched her heart in her throat as Darby and his elite guards systematically dismantled the invading force. They moved like shadows utilizing the estate's hidden defensive choke points. But there were simply too many of them. The thermal cameras showed a second wave of vehicles breaching the main driveway. "Focus, Chelsea," she whispered to herself, tearing her eyes away from the violent ballet on the security feeds. She turned her full attention to the 4 monitors. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, typing lines of complex code with blistering speed. She bypassed the Federal Reserve's secondary firewalls, utilizing a zero-day exploit she had discovered years ago, but never dared to use. She needed to route Moretti's billions through a digital labyrinth so convoluted that it would trigger the international anti-terrorism algorithms. Accessing FinCEN node. Spoofing credentials, Croft H, authorization level 9, target Corsa Holdings, Apex Consulting, Moretti Global. The building shuddered violently above her. Dust drifted down from the acoustic ceiling tiles. A muffled explosion indicated Moretti's men had breached the first floor of the mansion. Matteo stood by the door, an M4 carbine raised, his jaw clenched tight. "Miss Foster, we might need to relocate to the vault." "2 more minutes," Chelsea shouted over the din sweat beading on her forehead. She was in the zone, her brilliant mind visualizing the global flow of illicit capital, like illuminated rivers on a map. She highlighted the 50 offshore accounts holding the entirety of Salvatore Moretti's liquid wealth. She initiated a forced transfer, splitting the $3 billion into 10,000 microtransactions, and routed them simultaneously into the accounts of known blacklisted terror organizations monitored by the CIA before instantly bouncing them into an irrevocable, decentralized cryptocurrency black hole. Execute. She slammed the enter key. For a terrifying, agonizing 5 seconds, the terminal froze. Then a cascade of green confirmations flooded the screens. Suddenly, Matteo's radio crackled to life. It was intercepted audio from the Moretti tactical channel. "Command, this is Alpha Team. Our encrypted comms are going crazy. HQ is reporting a massive Swift lockout. The accounts are drained. Boss says the feds just raided the New York compound. We have no funding. Repeat, the contracts are voided. Abort, abort." Chelsea let out a ragged breath, collapsing back into her chair. Without money, the Mafia was nothing but thugs with guns. The mercenaries Moretti had hired were loyal to the dollar, not the man. On the security feeds, the tide instantly turned. The invading men began falling back, scrambling toward their vehicles, as their earpieces relayed the news that their paychecks had just evaporated into thin air. Darby's men mercilessly cut down those who were too slow to retreat. Silence slowly reclaimed the estate, broken only by the distant wail of approaching local sirens, which Darby had undoubtedly already bought and paid for. 10 minutes later, the heavy steel door of the command center groaned open. Darby stepped into the room. He was covered in soot, a bloody gash across his temple, and his crisp white shirt was ruined. But his dark eyes burned with an unholy, triumphant fire. He dropped his rifle, colamanced the room in long, predatory strides. Matteo discreetly slipped out of the room, leaving them alone. Darby reached Chelsea, hauling her up from the chair and pulling her flush against his solid, battle-hardened body. He didn't care about the dirt or the blood. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling her scent deeply. "It's done," Chelsea whispered, wrapping her arms securely around his broad shoulders, feeling the raw power of him beneath her fingertips. Salvatore Moretti is penniless, The feds are raiding his properties right now because of the terror flags. The empire is gone. Darby pulled back, framing her soft, beautiful, perfectly rounded face in his rough hands. He looked at her with a level of reverence and absolute adoration that stole the breath from her lungs. You didn't just save my life, Chelsea. You handed me the entire eastern seaboard. Darby murmured, his thumb tracing her lower lip. You are the most brilliant, dangerous, magnificent creature I have ever encountered. Chelsea looked into his eyes, finally shedding the last remnants of the invisible fat girl she used to be. I don't want to be hidden anymore, Darby. I don't want to be a secret. You will never be hidden. Darby vowed, his voice a low, thunderous rumble in the quiet room. Tomorrow I am taking you to the finest tailor's on the Magnificent Mile. We are buying out the Drake Hotel for a celebration. I am going to put a ring on your finger, so heavy it drags your hand down, and I am going to parade you in front of every boss, politician, and rat in this city. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. They will look at you, and they will know that you are the Queen of Chicago. And if anyone dares to look at you with anything less than absolute worship, I will blind them. Chelsea smiled, a slow, confident, devastating smirk that matched his own. She pulled him down by his ruined collar, crashing her lips against his. It wasn't a kiss of submission. It was a collision of equals. The girl nobody wanted had just rewritten the rules of the game, claiming her throne beside the most dangerous obsession she could have ever asked for. What did you think of Chelsea's epic transformation from an undervalued, invisible accountant into the undisputed queen of the Chicago underworld? Her journey proves that true power doesn't come from fitting into society's narrow expectations, but from embracing your own brilliant, unapologetic mind. If you loved the intense romance, high-stakes drama, and jaw-dropping twists as Chelsea and Darby took down the Moretti Empire together, make sure you don't miss out on our upcoming stories. Hit that like button, share this incredible story with your friends who love a fierce, plus-size heroine, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling Mafia romance dramas. Let us know in the comments which scene was your absolute favorite.